Men are the clear and obvious target of the entropic forces destroying our current culture. But, and crucially so, it is the women who are having their instincts overtly corrupted, whilst they are rewarded for it through their Freud, personal gratification, and Adler, status and power. This is not homeostatic. Without homeostasis, personal extinction is a very real threat, and the collective genome, right now, is sending out a stark alarm. In our previous video, Steve and Pauline Richards, depth psychologists with 43 years each of frontline clinical experience, discussed the terminal lucidity of the masculine, a potential outcome of this horrendous situation, whereby men will wake up and realise what's been done to them, but only after it's far too late to do anything about it. The same dynamic is true for women. Gratifying Freud and Adler, as women are being actively encouraged to do, might feel literally empowering, but it is a hideous trick. Those who go along with these tidal forces may feel rewarded and emboldened, but they are unknowingly igniting the flame of Charles Darwin. The genome always finds a way to test its own fitness, and if women do not wake up before the event horizon, then a terminal lucidity is sure to come to pass. To wake up, but only when it's too late. This information is absolutely crucial, but we are not at the point of no return just yet. The key, as always, must be, and is, consciousness. Men and women need to relate to each other. As Steve says in this video, the masculine and the feminine provide the context for each other. And as Pauline says in this video, it's incumbent upon women to understand themselves and their own psychology. Despite being constantly derided for it, and often being trapped by gurus along the way, many young men are actively seeking out the masculinity that has been robbed from them. Women need to do the same with their femininity. They need to rediscover their meta-instincts, their biologically encoded ancestral memory, and that deep, genomically confirmed sense of meaning that comes along with truly accepting oneself as a superpositioned biological, psychological, and social being, fully capable of relating properly, with respect for the past and a duty to the future. Only then can we prevent a terminal lucidity of the feminine.
Hi James, great to see you again.
Good to see you, James.
Likewise, guys. Hello.
So we're going to talk about the terminal lucidity of the feminine as a continuation on from our video on the terminal lucidity of the masculine.
We are. So from the last video, it was mentioned that there is a reciprocal act, obviously. There's a terminal lucidity of the masculine, but a feminine is also expected. And that's really the first thing I wanted to ask you guys on that is, which out of these two do you expect to come first? Or do you expect them to come at the same time? So with the masculine, obviously, it's too late. With the terminal lucidity, they wake up when it's too late. And if things do get to that point, which would be horrible if they do, will it be the men or the women who go first?
Yeah, that's very interesting.
It is a very interesting question. I have a view, but I'll let you.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Yes.
I would say that the men are going to be more aware of it being terminal before the women are, in terms of the duration of that lead in time to being terminal. And the reason for that is that they're actually the obvious main target out of the two. The real main target, though, is the women. In my view, I don't know if you'd agree with that.
I would agree with that. I'd agree that the men are ahead of the women.
Yeah.
Because they're the focus of so much misandry in the culture. So yes, I think they're more awake than women are.
Yeah. So the men in that sense are going to be targeted sooner. And that will give them an opportunity both to slip over the event horizon before the women do, but also to draw back. But because the women's instincts are being corrupted through misdirection. They appear to be gaining reward for what's happening, and that will probably mean that they'll switch on to what's happening to them further downstream, and it's more likely to be too late for them. What's your view on that then, Paul?
Well, I would agree with that completely, because we often use the Freud-Adler-Jung equation to understand a lot of this, a lot of what's going on in the culture. And I would say that women are still so preoccupied with Freud and Adler, and getting so much out of that, which I think is a suggestion that you made, with respect to their own status, their own gratification of instincts, that they're not going to want to give that up lightly.
No.
And there's obviously the culture regulates that top down and feeds it, and women are feeling stronger and more emboldened than they've ever done. But at the same time, the thing that's missing from that equation, of course, is Jung and the spiritual and meaning and proper feminine psychological development. That's relatively absent at the moment. So I think whilst they're still hooked into Freud and Adler, and they're getting something out of seeing men as the enemy and projecting all sorts of hostile, venomous things onto men, that will remain as is. So there does need to be an awakening from women. And I do think for that reason men are ahead of the curve.
Yeah, so the opportunity either to collapse then into the singularity of personal extinction, or to recover from that, is going to arise for men first. And that's because what's being done to the women is concealed, negatively concealed, because on the surface it appears to be positive.
It does.
And that's leading to an inflation that follows the Freud-Adler-Jung equation.
It does.
In terms of pathology.
Yes.
So the corrupted instincts that they have at the Freudian level are being manipulated through power. They're being gifted an amount of power, which it appears to gratify their instincts.
Yes.
And we would predict from that then, if we follow the equation, that soon, if it's not already happening, that their power principle will be elevated to a religious level, not just political. And at that point, it will become pathologically Jungian.
Oh, I think we're there now, actually.
Yeah,
yes.
I'd agree on that.
Yeah.
And yes, we know that this is a loop. So that falls back through Adler and into Freud. And it means it's not actually about gratification. It's about something else that's far more dangerous than just that. That comes in at a Freudian level from Darwin, we can say, while we're using that kind of metaphor, the Darwinian idea of selective pressures, which are pruning the population collectively. And those political groups that have been entrained, if you like, to deliver this kind of negativity towards men via women are actually in service of the genome as it begins to prune the population.
Yes. And
as we said last time, the genome itself has a kind of sentience and awareness of what it's doing on a species-wide level. And that is fundamentally what we're up against. And it's that most people, including evolutionary biologists, are unconscious of.
Yes, that's absolutely true. We're certainly seeing Freudian, Adlerian and Jungian pathology. It's, you know, we're seeing women elevated, all sorts of women across the board, being treated like goddesses sometimes in the culture. And again, women are lapping that kind of adulation up. Why wouldn't they at one level? Because they don't actually realize how they're being manipulated in other ways, and that idea of being elevated is going to be incredibly attractive at one level. But it's like a sick joke, really, that's being played on them, in effect. And that adulation in many ways, in many circumstances, is not warranted.
Yeah, oh God, no, absolutely not. And it's a useful thing to focus on the joke element, because that's the trickster dynamic.
It is indeed,
and it's the trickster that will augment and exaggerate a polarized dynamic like this, just to the point where it's about to completely bottom out into destruction, and then provide the opportunity to reverse it. So it's as if that when a mistake is being made at this level, at a species-wide level, then that trickster phenomenon kicks in to push and to pressure test in service of Darwin towards that tipping point, to see who will prevent this, who will act to prevent this from occurring. Then there will be a reduction in population, but those who survive will be better adapted. It's quite amazing to see that working through. And James, what would you think about that from the position of a molecular biologist and geneticist?
Oh, it's really interesting to hear you guys talk on this, because it matches evolutionary science, let's say, perfectly, and more so, in my opinion, than some evolutionary biologists, as we briefly spoke about last time, because what you're saying is empirical. It's completely empirical, and it matches Darwinian dynamics perfectly. A biological system, let's say just the genome and its dynamics, is under a necessary Darwinian impulse to keep itself around and alive. And the variation that's produced from generation to generation, and then the variation in adaptation that's produced by, let's say, complexes, is a big experiment from its point of view. And so if there's not a selection force, let's say from an overt means, as you guys have said before, like a war, for example, as there has been pretty much in every generation going back forever, the genome will find another way to do it. As it's almost like, and I don't mean this in a value judgment sense at all, this is from a molecular point of view, an increase in entropy. And the entropy is unsustainable generation to generation. So it's got to test itself. The trickster dynamic, it sounds like you guys are talking about, is obviously horrible, but it's constellated because people are not connected to their instincts. It's not inevitable, but it's inevitable because of the current setup that people have, let's say, with the complexes that they have. And if that's an accurate understanding, sort of mirrored back to you guys, but I think from the biological side, it's perfect, absolutely perfect.
Yeah, that fits really well. And as you say, our approach is psychodynamic, but it links with the biology and what you've done. And I know, obviously, that you're doing work on this, which will be published soon, which will be absolutely fantastic to see that in print. The mechanism whereby that can happen is understood. And then the extension of that into field theory, such as Rupert Sheldrake's work, shows how this can spread through an informational register at a field level, without direct psychological interpersonal contact, and without apparently direct genetic involvement too, or biological involvement. So information moves around and represents itself superpositioned in all of these states to form a field effect, which then regulates the whole. So yeah, it's a fascinating thing. But as we focus down on the specifics of what's happening now to women, one of the questions that you raised to us before we came on camera had to do with, has this happened before? And there is that saying, of course, that the best predictor of the future is the past. So we should look at history. Yes, things like this have happened before, insofar as when women move collectively in the way that they're moving now, then it's usually through some kind of group suggestion, which takes very readily with them. And it does so because it's aimed directly at their instincts. It doesn't go through cognition at all. Cognitive suggestion can be resisted relatively easily because you just offer another argument. And you go on in that philosophical way, one argument, the counter argument. But the minute that you aim at corrupting or misdirecting instincts, then people start to form groups and herds, the field effect is amplified, and then they move. And women have definitely been affected at that level, and have been so in the past.
Yes, they have. And obviously you're talking about fields in a specific context there, Steve, but it makes me think of a different kind of field, and the fields that the Women's Land Army worked in during the First and Second World Wars.
Oh, right. This is in the UK? This is in the UK
and America, actually.
Oh, right, cool.
But just right now, talking specifically about the UK. And the Women's Land Army was set up towards the end of the First World War. Although people tend to think of them as only coming in during the Second World War, they were present during the First World War as well. It was towards the end of the war, 1917, and it was set up in haste, basically because the UK was in danger of starvation. I think there was something like 3 weeks away from, being into starvation and into an untenable situation. And the government put a call to action out for young women to work on the land, in the fields, agriculturally. And something like 43,000 women responded to that call to action.
This is in the UK.
This is in the UK
specifically.
during the First and, of course, the Second World Wars. And as you're rightly saying, that appeal, although on the surface appeal to their patriotism and their sense of conscience about defending their own people and their own nation, or helping to sustain them by basically feeding them, by working on the land in such a way that the nation could be fed, appeal to them at that meta-instinctual level. And it was as if there was at that point, at that moment in history, a reawakening of meta instincts for women, right the way back to their Stone Age foremothers, who would have experienced a similar kind of situation when there was that sort of shift, that crossover period from a hunter-gatherer way of life to a more agrarian way of life. And so those meta instincts would have been in there and appealed to. And it explains really probably why so many women offered their services, why so many of them came forward. And they were all from very, very, very backgrounds. Some were very ordinary girls who had just worked in, say, domestic service or in factories before they were called. Others were from the aristocracy, from the landed gentry. So there was a whole, in terms of culture, they were all from very, very different social backgrounds.
Can I just ask then? So
yes.
in effect then, the meta instinct was like so deep that the surface differences in culture didn't matter.
They didn't matter, no.
So once the wider environment kicked in and generated a necessity, then they were all mobilized from within in response to an outer meta threat.
Right. That's exactly it.
So the aristocracy and ordinary women from the cities all found themselves working on the land as in effect gatherers rather than hunters. Usually, in that sense, because
and as I say, that sort of agrarian aspect as well, that it kind of represented that shift, ancestral shift too, from merely being gatherers to actually working on the land as well. And some of them had never done any manual work in their lives, and as you can imagine, that kind of work was very physically strenuous and arduous, and so they had to adapt to that physically as well. And some of the girls didn't get through. I think out of the 43,000, this is the First World War, that applied for recruitment, something like probably just over half of that figure were actually accepted in. And so there was quite a
selective pressure.
There was a selective pressure even then as to whom was chosen to do the work.
Well, you've discussed this with me off camera, which is informative. I know it's forming part of your work for the book that you're writing at the moment. But in the Second World War, this did happen in the First, but on a much larger scale in the Second World War with the Land Army.
That's right.
We had an influx of men from overseas.
We did.
That obviously amplified massively when the Americans came online for the war. 2 years late, my American cousins, but you got there eventually.
Got there,
But before that, we had Norwegians, we had Poles, we had the Free French, and meanwhile, the local men, British men, were serving overseas in the armed forces. And then they came in and they were camped all around the country. And then the Women's Land Army were there as well. And again, we saw meta instincts kicking in with respect to women being exposed to a new population, incoming population of men. And once again, those dynamics, those more primitive dynamics began to take hold. And that was amplified further when the Americans arrived, and there were literally millions of different men having contact with the female population in the UK.
Yeah.
So that does show what happens when populations shift.
Yes.
And that kind of thing was also present too, wasn't it, in Europe, occupied Western and Eastern and Southern Europe, when the German army moved in to those territories. A lot of local women were more than happy to freely associate with the occupiers because they demonstrated themselves to be militarily superior. They had more advantages, and a lot of women at the instinctive level moved towards collaboration sexually and in terms of power. Freud and Adler, again, with the invaders. And this is not a judgment, this is an observation of what happens over time, isn't it?
Well, it's a very important observation, because I think in that specific context, you have to remember too that the women who were employed to work on the land were doing men's work. They were doing the work of the men who were away. And those men that did stay, and some of them actually returned as well, were sent back to not just to work on the land, but munitions factories and so on, had to then compete with the women sometimes for their jobs, for their occupations. And I think the Land Army girls are a particularly good example of it, because they did what they did. By and large, and there are plenty of sort of first-hand accounts of how they, dealt with the situation in which they found themselves. They didn't complain about the arduous nature of the work. They took it on in with good humour, with good spirits, and they weren't hostile towards men. It wasn't as if it was like, well, we've taken men's jobs off them, and aren't we wonderful, and we look down on men, and we've had this opportunity to kind of be superior to them. They didn't have that attitude, and I just think that's so interesting, that despite the fact they did what they did, and apparently some of them would have considered them to have been equal to any man in terms of what they did, they nonetheless didn't like the word feminist because it had a ring of hostility to it.
Interesting.
And so they never used it, and they didn't have that cast of mind.
That's very interesting.
It is interesting.
Yeah, the implications of that, because there's an apparent historical, I implied that there might be resonance with today. It's only apparent. The differences, though, which make it not an exact repeat of the past, are where we're going to find out what's going wrong now. And what you've illustrated is that women's fundamental instincts from a Paleolithic, Darwinian, adaptive perspective did not really change. No. Even though they were being exposed, so to speak, to a different population of men, and therefore the inevitable happened, they were not hostile to men.
No, they weren't.
So whatever the outcome would have been to that war, so long as there was a breeding population of women and a breeding population of men, then within any territory, then the population would have been stable despite the losses, because there was a movement of population to keep it stable. But what's been happening recently is that women, in contradistinction to the example you've given, are being told to hate men. They're being given power without responsibility for what comes with that power, to overcome different strata of society which have been self-regulating for millennia, ever since we were civilized, basically living in cities and in that kind of culture. They've been given that. They're being told to hate men. Identity in all of its forms is being kaleidoscopically dispersed, which means it's far harder for a culture to sustain itself. It certainly can't reproduce in the usual way under those kinds of pressures. And it's running out of control. And there doesn't seem to be much indication from women that they do know that this is happening to them. And I would suggest that that's happening because they are being manipulated on their instincts. Once they are misdirected, there's virtually no resistance to it, because there's no conscious connection in most people to their instincts. So they don't know they're being led by them. Under normal homeostatic conditions, instincts will regulate our consciousness. They creep up on us in the form of intuitions, feelings, sudden urges to action, inspirations, that kind of thing, whilst the ego, normal consciousness, is busy thinking that it's in charge. Jung identified this, and he made it very clear that the normal consciousness is directed by other forces. But those forces are deeply instinctual, as you've been saying. And we now have a unique situation. And the question is, who is regulating that? Is it the politicians? They're certainly involved, but are they themselves only being directed by the genome collectively because of the kind of thing that we mentioned last time? But there's a general ignorance of what consciousness is. So if we were to suggest that the genome was sentient, they say, it can't be. It's not like me, not like how I think. How can that be a model of consciousness that the genome has? Well, the answer to that is that the genome is not conscious in that way. It's a field resonant complexity of information that understands its status with respect to the species as a whole and the environment as a whole, and it reacts to it simultaneously at superposition levels, which include culture, include psychology, include biology. And the evidence, the empirical evidence for this, is in the behavior of large groups of people who seem to be directed unconsciously, that is to say, not psychologically, through conscious will or intention, by another motivating force. The ultimate motivating force is the genome and its expression. And the genome is, in this sense, the master, and its emissary are the instincts. And therefore it delivers that out into the world. And now we're at that position where it is superpositioned, and the politicians are going along with it, and the women are going along with it, and the men are going along with it, and all sorts of things are going wrong simultaneously as we head towards that point of collapse.
Yeah, well, if I can just return for a moment back to sort of the World War I, World War II scenario, because contemporaneously with what was happening with the Women's Land Army, we have things like the Suffragette movement, for example, who interestingly responded differently to, you know, the war scenario, in so much as they had almost a more parasitical relationship to it. It was, they could, you know, they could find a way of utilizing the war and the arguments for war to further their own activism. And in that sense, it was very self-serving again. So we see, you know, sort of Freud and Adler in there. And it just, it kind of formed in complete contradistinction to the kind of generative work that the Women's Land Army were doing. And that, for me, that's sort of the last point, if I go back in time in history, but recent history, that I could pinpoint as being a time when women fully expressed meta instincts in a healthy and adapted way. I think since then we've been on a bit of a downward spiral, a downward curve, probably because when the Women's Land Army was wrapped up in 1950, when it was disbanded, many of the values that were tied up with it weren't passed on from generation to generation. So those women that worked on the land, I think probably, and because you see this in every generation, they probably wanted it to be easier for their children. They didn't want them to have such a hard time of it, so they treated them differently. And those valuable things that they learned and they earned by working in the way that they did weren't passed on. And so there was almost a whole generation of women that came after them who were less practical, who didn't understand fully the value of what their mothers had done, and their foremothers before them, because you obviously can go right back in time, as we were saying earlier. And had they persisted as a movement in the way that, say, you know, the suffragettes had, and, you know, various feminist movements that have come since then there would have been something to contradict the kind of radical feminism that we're up against now, and the kind of misandry that we're up against now in the culture. But there hasn't been that this far, or since that time that I can see anyway. And I think that's been a great loss. I think history would have been different had that happened, had it persisted. I mean, they tend not to even be remembered in things like Remembrance Day parades. They tend not to be asked to attend. It's like they've been lost to history. And some of that, I think, is because as an organisation, they've almost had this kind of deferent attitude towards the likes of the suffragettes and the other aspects of the women's movement as a whole. And they've taken a step back and seen them as being the ones who have taken all the risks, who have done the dangerous things, who have had the risky ideology, who have put themselves in threatening positions physically. And when you analyse it, it couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, for me, if anything, it's probably compensated superiority in an Adlerian sense
for the women's land,
for the women's land army.
Got you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the suffragette movement then was a very small group of people at the apex of the population of women, apex only in representational terms, not in any value.
No, sure.
But they got and have had and continue to have much more attention and representation
in the culture,
but their effect actually was quite minimal, wasn't it, in terms of when things got really desperate. Then it was the meta-instinctive, what Jungians would call archetypal connection that women had.
Well, absolutely. I mean, even Emmeline Pankhurst apparently said herself during the First World War that, you know, the suffrage movement actually started to fragment around that time, and her perspective was that, well, what's the point in having the vote if there isn't a country to vote in? And you know, it was, even in her there was some dim awareness that you know, there was this sort of meta instinctual need that had to be addressed before anything else was addressed. So there was
that's hugely interesting. I'm sorry, because I guess it does put the present times into perspective. Do we have to wait then? And of course the implication is we do, until we're nearly at the point of complete collapse. But it may or may not be in the form of a global war, but the culture itself has to get that close before there'll be sufficient energy constellated within it to reverse things. And there's too much comfort. And
there is
now. You seem to be saying earlier, and I would agree with that. For the women of today, they're spoiled. Massively spoiled, and have not had to fight for anything really. They've been gifted it.
They have.
And so they can treat their men with contempt, and in so doing, and they do. And in so doing, then they actually are in service through that shit testing process of the genome, which is looking to select the most adaptive and stable elements within the population to continue the population on. So it will want to prune away those who are not able to adapt and who are regressive. But the complexity of a human culture is such that the superpositioning pools information at those different levels, and this is where individual consciousness comes in. I would say that those who are only conscious of the political element within it will be ignorant of biology completely. Those who are into biology and politics will have a bigger picture, but those who are ignorant of the field effects of the movement of information will not see the complete picture at all, because they will generally fall down into this old tired argument of, is it, you know, nature or nurture, you know, which of course and the solution to that is, oh, it's somehow both. Well, it's more than that. Because the field effect itself transcends the ordinary progression in an evolutionary sense of culture and even of biology. It superintends that and regulates that. So we need to move into a different level of understanding. And once you're there, you can see truly the bigger picture and how information does move. We just tend to see it collapsed or pooled into one or more levels at any one time. I think it's really struck home to me where the parallel does exist in what you said.
Well, those women, again, who worked on the land, when the war ended, as I said before, the Women's Land Army wasn't disbanded till 1950. So 5 years after the war, women were still doing that kind of work. And there were plenty of women as well, as again I said earlier, who were working in munitions factories, and they were far better paid than most of the women who were working on the land.
Yeah.
And of course, you know, horrible, dangerous, life-threatening work in many ways.
In the munitions.
In munitions, but they were, you know, they were rewarded because, you know, they were on good pay. Those women couldn't wait to get out of the factories at the end of the war, but those women who worked on the land, a lot of them continued to work on the land. And it was almost as if they had a love affair with the land, if I can put it so prosaically. They were, despite how grueling it was, and you can imagine some of the kind of work they were doing, ploughing fields, felling trees, thatching roofs, dealing with raging bulls, all sorts of dangerous and difficult work. But at the same time, they were growing things, they were nurturing the land, they were cultivating uncultivated land. And you can see where that the superposition resonance would be with that for women meta-instinctually, just how important it would be to tend to the land, to grow things, to provide food that would not only feed them and maybe their friends and some of their families, but feed a nation. That's incredibly inspiring and motivating. You can see why so many of them, you can see that broad appeal and why so many of them signed up for it. It's an incredible thing. And as I say, you know, that goes back right to the Paleolithic. It's so deep within us as women. And to watch the change of the seasons, to watch the land change, you know, to go from working, say, the fields in autumn with the huge harvest moon and the brown furrows of land, and you know, to actually be involved in ploughing it, and the satisfaction that those women got from doing it themselves must have just been it must have been transcendent, actually.
Real transpersonal.
Oh, definitely.
At a psychological level.
There's the transpersonal in biology as well.
An instinct, as you've always said.
As we've always said.
You've always said.
Yes. And there was a huge amount of poetry written too by those women, and some of the men too, who obviously were there as well at the time, because they felt so inspired by what they were doing. And I think, I mean, I know James sort of asked the question recently about what is femininity. I think in order to answer that, you can't collapse into cognition. You have to feel your way in. You have to find the affect. You have to find the carrier wave back into meta instincts and feel your way into it. Then you will understand what that is. And those women were strong. They were robust mentally, they were robust physically. Even if they didn't start off that way, they became that way. They created themselves so that they were able to do those things. And they did it with, like I say, with good cheer, with good humor. They were teased, they were tormented by the agricultural communities that existed at that time, and it didn't stop them. And they were poorly paid, but at the end of a long day in the field, they'd cycle to a dance, you know, and meet the local men, the local forces, and at Christmas time they might you know, cut a bit of mistletoe from the hedgerows or something like that. And it was just those small things that were imbued with so much importance, simple things, because they really didn't have that much materially. And that comes back to what you were saying before, Steve, about the women of today being so spoiled that there's so little value, there's so little of appreciation for the things that really matter. Because it's in the wrong place. It's all in the wrong place. It's in you know, it's in materialism. It's about acquiring things that have no inherent value or worth. And so I feel sorry really for those women who aren't in touch with those kinds of things, because they are transcendent. It's the appreciation of the little things that truly matters. And in that sense, those women were rich.
Yeah,
they really were truly rich in that most fundamental way. And you know, although I'm closer in generation to them than a lot of women, I can envy them that, because I think it was so important, what they did and what they went through. And it's just sad that it's been lost to history.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I was able to resonate on a feeling level with all of that. And of course, because that was so Paleolithic and meta-instinctive, it came out, didn't it? And it literally rooted itself in the earth.
Yes, it did.
And then you got the reaction of those women to men locally, with respect to the local men who were there. And local included incoming men.
It did, yes.
But those men who were not there, who were overseas, say, fighting, the fact that the local men were not there, but the women then took to the earth, literally, that in itself is a very balanced way that the human populations have regulated themselves in the past. To protect the homeland, the ground of the tribe, was the role of the men. The women sustain that through the ground and through relating to the ground. And we're seeing something like this now in what's going on in the other side of Europe from where we're based at the moment. And it is terrible at one level, but it is also instinctive. And a lot of the people who are being pulled into that fighting, the men, are being pulled in on the basis of instinct and meta-instinct, which has been repressed in them. And this is why that can run out of control, which we discussed last time. So that the harmony for those for men has to be found in the harmony within women, because they are the context for one another. They make sense of their own existence through relationship to the other. It's just the way it is biologically. It's the case. And like you say, now you've got women who are more concerned about breaking their nails.
Absolutely.
Or, you know, whether the hair's done or whether it might be, or whether they've got a trout pout or you know, tats or piercings. And it runs away with itself, and it's encouraged to run away with itself, because a small part of instinct is being exaggerated by those forces that would manipulate them into a position where they self-select for deletion, apart from the few who will not. And that's the terrible crisis that we're in. And as we move up the superposition level, then towards that surface structure that I've just been describing, that's where we see the complexity. And the complexity is overwhelming.
It is,
whereas the deep structures are simple. Instincts are simple.
They are.
It's what happens on the surface that is the problem. So if you can misdirect an instinct to change what happens on the surface, you can basically trash an entire population easily. And these young women have been misled by their instincts, or their instincts have been misled away from what their instincts in their genome would want. But Darwin is cruel. Darwin will say it doesn't matter. As long as there's enough of you to at least reproduce a sustainable population, the size of it doesn't matter. You talk yourself out of this. You infantilize yourself out of reproduction. You inflate, that's fine. The terminal point is coming. The selective pressure will amplify and you will be deleted. Just as the men who push the side of the masculinity that's too exaggerated will themselves also be deleted. It's interesting. Do you have any thoughts on that, James? Sorry, we've had a bit of a...
No, I'm really listening to you guys talk. There's so much in what you've said. I think the first thing to go on, I mean, first of all, Pauline, when you're describing almost like a day in the life to some degree of someone in the Women's Land Army, I definitely felt into that and what you meant. Almost as if it was like watching a movie from a very long time ago that had never even been made. It was almost like not my ancestral memory per se, but something was perceiving something. And I was actually going to ask you, but I think Steve got there first. I was going to say, so being pretty is not synonymous with being feminine in a meta-instinctive sense.
Absolutely not.
And that's fascinating, because I didn't think it was, but when you're saying, Steve, about women being concerned about breaking their nails and all the other things, that's my experience of women growing up in this culture, born in with myself, 96, that's what women were like almost universally. And I did perceive a difference in generations, especially my grandparents' generation, for sure, born in the 20s, or even a bit earlier than that. But this generation, that is femininity. So I think what motivated my initial question to you guys off camera, what is femininity, is that never felt right to me at all. But in short, what you said, Pauline, did resonate a lot. However, I'm finding it a little bit difficult at the moment to link, obviously, that wonderful scenario up, or healthy homeostatic scenario up, with the Women's Land Army, and what women could practically do today. So if even down to small things, like if they live in a city, there is no land to go to and look after. That's being handled, covered. Is there anything women could do practically with a different surface structure representation that's still activating those deep Paleolithic meta instincts?
I would say one thing, if
Yes,
I can.
of course, Steve, yeah.
The simplest and most difficult thing for them to do is to relate to men in a complementary way.
Yes.
Because that will automatically bring out the right kind of regulation at an instinctive level. But if they see themselves as opponents to men and competitors, then they're actually destroying the ground upon which they stand themselves, as well as the entire culture.
Yeah.
They're being callously manipulated at one level by politicians who themselves are being manipulated by Darwinian forces. So they need to become conscious of the fact that they have a context which includes men. And equality is simply that which will emerge out at a humanistic level from relating properly to the other. And insofar as they don't do that, then they are the authors of their own demise and destruction.
Yeah, I mean, if I could sort of, again, by way of, I know, sort of coming sort of a bit of a long way round to it, but illustrate it by way of some of the things that I've been writing, and it links up with what you've just said, Steve, really, that the way I've tried to write my book is to write it as a feminist would write it. Certainly a section of it. It's not all about the history of feminism, but there is a section on that. And then to work through it gradually, deconstructing it sort of from sort of the inside out. And I've kind of almost deliberately put myself through that process, really, because I think I wanted to try and get into the way in which they think about things, the way in which they construct their arguments, both in terms of, expressed argument and also the kinds of things that they write about. And the one thing that I've found that runs through all of it, and that's going sort of way back in time, even sort of back to somebody, say, like Mary Wollstonecraft, one of the founding mothers of feminism back in the 18th century, is that there's this tone of righteous indignation. I mean, we kind of see it today, even in young women like Greta Thunberg, and I know we kind of make fun a little bit of her and say, how dare you? Some people do, but they make fun of that sort of expression, when she says, how dare you? But it kind of sums up that righteous indignation that a lot of feminists have. And it's fueled by lots of things, really. It's often fueled by a lot of pain and a lot of anger and anguish, and it pervades everything that they do and say and write about.
It's Ardler, isn't it?
It's Ardler.
Yeah,
it is absolutely Ardler. Yeah. And you have to be able to get outside of that. Women have to be able to get outside of that to see how they're being manipulated. And that requires them to be more discriminating, almost in that sort of collapsed Jungian sense of developing the positive animus, to be able to see through the arguments, to see where they're one-sided, to see where they're being fueled by other things rather than sort of any kind of rational debate or discussion. There's usually a lot of strong emotion behind what they do and what they say and what they write about. If you get outside of that, immediately you start to wake up to how you're being manipulated. And that's a strong position to be in. It's a position that women need to get themselves into in order to see how they're being manipulated. And once you've done it, it's like a lot of things in life, isn't it? Once that light goes on, it's not difficult to see.
No. Thanks for that. That just personally, that's really helped and sparked quite a few things off for me. So instincts in men and women then are meant to trigger one another's instincts, and the further back we go, the more harsh they're going to be, because survival was harsher. Adaptive pressures were simpler but very, very punishing. So the women should select the men, but the men should also select the women. And insofar as they become separated from contact with one another, they can't. They both will become exaggerated but not connect. And so the system that supported humanity from the beginning throughout its evolution is now, or wouldn't then be, removed. And so everything would exaggerate, inflate, one-sided, and then collapse. But there will be a few people, nevertheless, who will see through it. And that will be catastrophic. At the political level, in terms of population numbers, at the political level, the manipulation is vast. 15-minute cities, lockdowns, manipulation over food, the kind of political gaslighting and bullshit that is going on globally, but particularly in the West, will form a positive feedback loop heading in a negative direction, which will reach the point at which it cannot sustain even itself. That is to say, that negative dynamic can no longer support itself, and even that will break down, and there'll be chaos everywhere. The problem will be, of course, that there'll be some areas of the world and some cultures and populations that will not go through that process. And Darwin's rules, so to speak, would suggest then that those populations and cultures will occupy the niche spaces that have been voided by the West. And that's one alternative. And the genome won't care. It won't care at all, but it'll just allow it to happen. It's, if you like, the analog is red squirrels and grey squirrels. They're both squirrels, both species or populations of squirrel, but one is more adapted than the other to specific local conditions. And then the niche space is voided, first of all, and then it's overrun. And this is at a human level. It has nothing to do with ethnicity as such. At a human level, where specific local populations are being manipulated. And if you were malevolent and wanted to bring down a crash, then if I would target the women.
Oh, definitely.
Because once the women are into themselves and not into their ancestral and genomic understanding of what femininity is and relating is, then the men are immediately neutered in the local population. That will either invite a compensation by a more vigorous male population to come in and regulate the women by force, the very thing that they say they don't want, or it'll mean that the entire niche space collapses and there'll be a mass population transposition of another culture into that niche space. That's what happens.
It is.
It happens with people. History demonstrates that's the truth. It happens between animals, populations that will compete for the same kind of niche space. So I would say the terminal lucidity of the feminine, it has to be, as you were saying, Paul, about consciousness.
It does. The task for women is to, for those women who are conscious, is to deselect themselves from those women that would continue the corruption of feminine or female meta instincts. And that's where the light needs to go on for women. The war is not between men and women. The war is within women. For sure. And if women can decide that they're no longer going to play the game, this cruel game really that's being played on them, that makes them caricatures of themselves. It's, like you said earlier, Steve, this is the trickster's job, isn't it? To sort of say, this is where we're heading. This is the picture that we're painting. This is the caricature. This is what you're becoming, but you're not seeing it. And if you don't correct for it in time, well, this is what will happen. The various scenarios are painted. It's whether we just wake up to them in time. But the real battle is within.
I'd agree,
or
yeah.
between women.
I'd agree. And there's a selective pressure that comes from both the biological sexes towards one another, isn't there? For high value men to even exist, they have to be cultured with respect to the expression of their instincts towards being high value enough for women to think that they are valuable. So the way to interfere with that is to say that all men are of low value, all men are toxic and negative. And to generate a stereotype within the culture, the stereotype of the collective consciousness of women in the collective consciousness, that all men are low value. Then there'll be a movement of energy towards self-exaggeration. And if the men respond by becoming hyper-masculine in a toxic sense, all they're doing is confirming that which is pushing the women towards their own collapse. But then equally, if women want to become conscious and prevent this from happening and have an investment in the future and not in their own immediate gratification in a destructive way, they have to be able to signal to men that they are of high value. And that will then encourage the men to change and not to exaggerate themselves as a polarity. And of course, the more you can obscure basic biological roles by a cultural suggestion of overlay of variegation, should we say, in identifications between biological sexes, then it's what the hell am I and what the hell are you and what's my role? I cannot then connect to my meta instincts. But maybe we should just explain what meta instincts are, and because we've spoken for a while, let's put this on James.
Not to explain what meta instincts are.
How about that? Because we've been speaking for a while now.
Well, it's interesting. I was going to ask you on that too, but the difference between the meta instinct and the actual behavior or the presentation in representation, because these things, it's something that I've seen from people of a certain side of the political spectrum, generally speaking, challenging concepts like masculinity and femininity and saying that they're all relative, essentially. Well, they vary from culture to culture. They're social constructs. They don't exist. We've made them up, and we've made them up for power reasons to oppress one person or another, and all of that kind of stuff, which I'm sure people watching are broadly familiar with. It's like a meme throughout the culture. But no, the meta instincts are first and foremost biological, that then become psychological. They're both superposition between both, that lie in innate, latent in the beginning representational form within the genome. And one way of thinking about it is essentially ancestral memory or patterns of adaptation and behavior that are on timed release from the genome, to say this is the canonical or broad span canonical of what human beings have always done, and these are latent and looking for activation within a human being. So we're not infinitely malleable with things like these let's say biological categories being made up. They're not made up. The surface presentations can certainly vary within certain bounds, but the fundamentals have to be activated. And something is very useful to know, which I've learned from you guys, is if that isn't there, that's when things go wrong. That if the meta instincts are inappropriately activated or they're not activated at all, that's colloquially you're disconnected from your instincts, let's say, in the broadest sense. Then the more fundamental instincts that you guys are talking about will fire off on their own. And when they fire off on their own, that's when you get, not very nice things happening, because suddenly Darwin switches on and goes, wait a minute, we're under a high selection pressure environment. Now I'm going to focus purely on my own gratification and my own power. And so without those meta instincts, women are going to be more likely to be pulled into, let's say, those mass movements, right? Which then act as a neurotic alibi, really, for, I believe in these political ideals because I've cognitively worked them through first principles. It's like incorrect. As you guys have said, cognition is always downstream of affect, which is the carrier wave of instinct. So it's instinctual what people are doing. So in that, implicitly, it's like if the genome has your back, if you just allow it to.
Yes,
it's got your back. So it's a difficult thing to do. It's a relatively simple thing to do. In broad terms.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's a great summary. So we can say then that to answer the question, what is femininity anyway, there's a genetic blueprint for that, which beyond the simple blueprint itself has an anticipated scenario for its development over the lifespan. That's on timed release. So at certain ages, certain parts of the meta instinct are released to accommodate the expression of what are called Panksepian instincts after Jaak Panksepp. but they are highly charged in terms of libido for adaptive and survival purposes. And if the meta instincts have been misdirected or corrupted, then they just shoot off and fire randomly, generate all sorts of problems. And one of the solutions, which is not a real one, but the apparent solution, as you've highlighted, is politics and mass movements and group identification. So that's the point at which, the articulation point at which, if you're going to interfere with the expression of femininity on a collective level, that's where you operate. You misdirect Panksepian instincts into a pseudo meta instinct, which then brings about the kind of destructive change that we're seeing at the moment.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely true, Steve. And the whole of the feminist movement as an organized movement across time is that of a political movement. It's right in there. It's in the fabric of feminism. So we need to have something that stands outside of that understands femininity properly and isn't just skewed in that direction. And like I said, that is the task for women, really, is to uncouple themselves from that. I mean, one of the ways that I think politics, that is, manipulates women top down, is to make them feel dissatisfied with their lot. And it does that by making them feel the tension or amplifying the tension between their biological nature and those other parts of their nature that are separate to that and to do with their own personal development. And those things are naturally in tension for women most of the time, because that's the hand that they've been dealt. There's no escaping that. Women can't escape their biology. And they can't escape the fact that they are also a person, a human being outside of the context of their biology. They have to find a way of navigating both. And if they haven't done that successfully, they're open to manipulation by something like politics, because it will play on that split, on that division in their nature. And that's why it works so well. And women don't know whether they're coming or going half the time. Should they have children? Shouldn't they have children? If they do have children, should they be at home with them all the time, or should they be out at work, or should they be developing themselves in some other way? That tension is always there, and I guess it's for each individual woman to work out what is the right kind of combination or configuration for them. But you can see how that's open to manipulation. And then again, coming back to classical Jung for a moment, we get into negative animus territory, for example. And you can then see how that would be a gift to the negative animus, really, because not only would the negative animus in that classical sense turn on the woman and make her doubt herself and hate herself and feel that she's all sorts of irrational things, but it also means that she will relate to men in a similar way too. What is within, so too is without. And I think that's the thing that women really need to look out for, because that, more than anything, is manipulated by the culture, and it keeps women dissatisfied. And like I say, you contrast that with the Women's Land Army, in an emergency situation where they don't have the luxury, really, of ruminating about these things, of whether they have a cleaner or don't have a cleaner, or they've sent their children to nursery or they haven't sent the children to nursery. The fundamentals of those situations were such that they were transcended completely. They weren't important. What was important was keeping everybody fed and having the right kind of value set, and women and men respecting one another for the work that they were doing. And I think if we could get closer to that, we'd be closer to resolving things. So that's a bit of a round the house.
No, it's
my perspective.
It's a whole field perspective on how things are and the dynamics of it. So there are things women can do, but fundamentally they need to become conscious, don't they, of what's being done to them.
They do, absolutely.
And men and women need to make themselves complementary and high value. rather than pseudo high value,
Yes.
and collapsed into themselves at the level of gratification.
Yeah.
But that will take relating, won't it?
It will.
So men will have to be the best version of a man they can be without being toxic, but at the same time assertive of their masculinity, and relate to women in a way that selects for those who are of high value, which should force women to move more in that direction. And women should do the same towards men, and then the culture will settle down.
Yes.
But it'll probably take a while before that happens, and the absurdity we're going through now is going to be amplified more before we reach that point. But if it's not, then we'll probably see that terminal lucidity of the feminine just before most of them are snuffed out by their own actions.
Well, I think it's incumbent upon women to understand themselves and their own psychology first.
Yeah.
And how can they possibly understand men and relate to men? How can men understand women if women don't understand women? It's that fundamental.
Yeah.